Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are today. Thanks for joining Digital Stratosphere. Really excited to have you all here today. We have a great turnout here today, great group of participants, great speaker lineup, and I'm really excited to do this. Before we get started, just a couple logistical things for the conference. First of all, the start time for each of the days of this week are going to be at this exact time. So if you're in a different time zone and you're wondering what time does it start every day this week, this exact time is when we start. We go for 3 hours every day. There's 3 sessions every day, except for Friday where we have 2. A couple other logistical things. Everyone should be muted, I believe, although Zoom, as you know, has had some security issues over time, but I believe everyone's muted, but we do encourage participation, and we'll get to how we encourage that here in just a second. Before I get into an introduction of the session and myself, a couple logistical things. Each session is about 50 minutes. Each of these sessions we could talk for hours about, so they're meant to be kind of a high level discussion of each of these topics. We encourage you to submit any questions you have via the chat function. You may not be able to chat with each other, but anything you do chat right now will be shared with us, with the speakers. And the other thing too is we're trying to make this as interactive as possible, even at the speaker level. We don't want this to be a one-way communication, partly because that would be a painful experience for everyone to listen through, but also because given the topic and the nature of where we are in the world today, we really want to learn from each other and learn from as many different people as we can. So that's the intent of the general format of today. We certainly have PowerPoint materials that we'll be reviewing, and we'll be presenting certain topics and certain materials, but we also want to make this engaging and interactive. We will throughout the week be announcing virtual happy hours, just offline sessions, smaller groups. This is a pretty large audience here today. We had close to 700 people register. So we'll see, it looks like we have about 150 people on the line right now. I suspect that number will ebb and flow throughout the week here. Sessions are being recorded, so if you miss any part of this, or you really like a session, you want to go back and hear it again, or you want to share it with a colleague, we're recording all of these sessions, and we'll share those with you as we go through. And if you have any technical issues as we're going through the sessions here, I encourage you to please just send an email to info@thirdstage-consulting.com. So today's session, defining your transformation strategy in a post-COVID-19 world. It's the first of 3 sessions we're going to do today. This is the agenda of what we'll cover in today's Stratosphere sessions. First one being defining your transformation strategy. Second one being how organizations are adjusting their transformations in today's reality. So this will be a panel discussion here in 1 hour from now, or just under 1 hour. There'll be several of us just going through some different topics and questions. But again, we encourage you to ask the questions. In fact, if you have a question you want to ask right now, go ahead and submit it, because we're all going to see it, and all the speakers will see it, and we'll be able to address those questions at any point. Or if you have a question for the speakers at any point along the way, even if they're in the middle of talking, go ahead and send the chat. We'll get to it, as many of those questions as we can. So how organizations are adjusting will be the panel discussion here in 1 hour. And then in 2 hours from now, the third session will be how to negotiate and renegotiate ERP contracts during crisis. So Marcus Harris and Daniel Saidi from Taft Law, 2 experts that focus on ERP vendor contracts, will be providing some good takeaways and lessons, not just for contract negotiations in general, but also for organizations that are trying to figure out how do we navigate this whole situation we're in right now with COVID-19 and the impacts to our business. Perhaps our needs have changed. How do we navigate this landscape that we're in now, and how do we protect ourselves legally and mitigate risk? That'll be the focus of the session here, session number 3. The full agenda was emailed to all of you prior to this, so I feel free to, I encourage you to go check out the agenda, know which ones you're most interested in. If there's other colleagues you'd like to invite, there's still time for them to register as well. So this first session will be defining your transformation strategy in a post-COVID-19 world. Really wanted to take this topic along with a lot of the other topics we're talking about here today to make this a little bit more relevant for where we are in the world today. Things look a lot different, now than they did even just a month or 6 weeks ago. And so the idea here is, what do we do if that strategy we had in late 2019 or early 2020 is completely obsolete or irrelevant now? Or what do we do now if we need to define our strategy and just figure out how we're going to move forward with a transformation strategy? How do we do that in the context of the world we're in now from a health and an economic perspective? And again, there's just a lot that looks different today. So navigating your strategy for your transformation can look a lot different, and it may need to look a lot different, at least in the short term. And by the way, one thing I want to note about all the speakers here today is every single speaker that you'll hear from today is independent and technology agnostic. So we're not here to push any sort of software or peddle any sort of technology. We're here simply to agnostically and objectively talk about, what are some of the creative ways you can do to navigate the situation without trying to force fit answers that may have worked in 2019, but they may not be working here today. So just a real quick introduction to myself. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent technology agnostic consulting firm that helps clients through their transformations. We do everything from digital strategy, software selection, organizational change, implementation, quality assurance, and others. So that's a bit about my background. Third Stage actually just over the weekend celebrated its official 2-year anniversary. So it's a company that Brian Potts, who you'll hear from as well, and I started 2 years ago after leaving a previous company that he and I had worked at for over a decade. And I'd started that company as well. So I've been in this independent technology space for a long time and really look forward to the conversation here today. So before we get started, and by the way, you're gonna have to bear with us because this is new to us as far as this large audience and this format. Usually the Stratosphere conference is something we do in person. It's typically an in-person event. So this is our first stab at taking it online and via live stream. So bear with us as we work through our own logistical kinks and whatnot. But I do want to just quickly, as we're getting started here, share a poll with you. And I just want to find out where you all are in your respective journeys and at your respective companies. Really just want to get an understanding of what best describes how COVID-19 has impacted your overall transformation strategy and plan. So, are you continuing your transformation as planned? Are you scaling back? Are you pausing? Are you about to start one and you're waiting to get started shortly? Or are you uncertain in how it'll be impacted? You should see a poll in front of you. If you don't, just chat me and let me know, but I did launch it, although I'm not seeing any responses, which suggests you may not be seeing it right now. So let me know. But what we're trying to get an understanding of, to the extent we can, is what are the, where is everyone in this whole journey? Because I think, one of the unique things that we're finding with our clients is that companies are impacted in a number of different ways. Some are impacted in a way where they're being forced to cut budgets or resources. Some are seeing surges in demand or shifting demand or whatever the case may be. So there's a lot of different ways that companies might be impacted here. So, take a second, if you don't mind, share your response here. I'd love to see just where your heads are and what kind of audience we're dealing here with, and that'll help us tailor some of the content here for today's session. So actually, I'm going to go ahead and share results, which again, I've never done this before, and it's not working. So I don't see what the results are. I don't know if you can see. I just said I shared the results, but it's showing me 0 responses and 0%, even though several of you had said you responded. So okay, everyone's saying they can see them. I can't. So I'd love to know what they say. Brian, I don't know are you able to see what they say there?
I am. So yeah, I'll summarize real quickly. We've got roughly 30% on the line that's responded that said we are continuing our transformations as planned. That's a fairly good number in comparison, I think, to global organizations we've talked to. 14% said we're scaling back due to health or economic issues. 20% are pausing. 10% beginning to planning to begin shortly, and 26% are uncertain. So a fairly even mix across the board with the leader continuing as planned.
That's interesting. That's something actually you and I talked about just last week. It seems like that there's more than I thought, and I think maybe more than you thought, that are moving forward as planned, and we kind of expected more of a hit or impact in some ways.
Yeah. Thank you all for responding.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. That's a great response. And thank you for helping me through my first Zoom polling experience, which of course I waited until there's 200 people live in front of me to to try it out. So thank you for that. So that hopefully gives us some good backdrop or understanding of where you all are. And I think what you'll find is that a lot of what we'll talk about here in this session and other sessions coming through today, a lot of this is going to be very relevant, regardless of where you are in your journey. And the idea is that we want to appeal to all the different audiences that are in different spots. So I guess if we back up, one word that is in some ways it sounds a little out of tune with reality today is the whole word digital transformation. And I don't know if it's just me or just kind of the risk adverse side of me that thinks, when I hear digital transformation, I hear risk, I hear cost, I hear, lots of resources. And some companies may need to be in a position to view digital transformation in the traditional sense, and others may not. And so what the way we look at digital transformation, though, is anything that involves any sort of technology implementation. So it doesn't necessarily need to be a big, massive, high risk, high cost undertaking. There's a lot of different ways we can view digital transformation. And the key here is what we'll talk about in this session and other sessions is how do we define digital transformation in a way that makes sense to us in the context of where we are in a call it a post-COVID-19 world. And again, if we're one of the ones that are, we're one of the 14% that are scaling back, or 20% that are pausing, or the ones that are about to start, the ones that are uncertain, we have to figure out what's the right path for us. And regardless of what other companies are doing or what software vendors or system integrators might think we should be doing, more than ever, we really have to focus on our own organizations and kind of take care of ourselves in a lot of ways, and really figure out how do we leverage technology, where does it make the most sense to leverage technology, and where are those more maybe nice to haves that maybe in different times we might think about deploying, but maybe it doesn't make sense now. Or what Brian and I are seeing, and I think the 30% of you that are in the as planned category, or the 10% of you that are planning to start a transformation, you might be in a position that Brian and I are seeing a lot of companies are coming to us with, where they're saying, hey, we're using this as an opportunity to really get ahead and double down on some of our strategic investments and take advantage of the fact that we have relative idle time and we have some resources available that aren't as fully utilized. So let's figure out a way to move forward. So really just depending on where you are is going to lead you to a different strategy. And so the idea here today is not to share with you a one size fits all answer, but just how do we get to an answer that makes the most sense for us. Now, when we think about how ERP implementations, traditional ERP implementations of the past, how they compare to what we would call digital transformation, which is a little bit more holistic or complete view and a more technology agnostic view of transformation. The old school ERP implementation approach was we go find one big system, it's focused on inventory, financials, and kind of automating all that back office stuff. And we are doing that as a way to automate processes, and we're going to train people on how to use the software and really focus on efficiency and driving lower IT costs. And none of that is totally obsolete or irrelevant. But when we think of digital transformation, we think of something a little bit different. And that's especially true in today's COVID-19 world. And when I say COVID-19 world, by the way, there's a lot of dimensions to that, obviously. I mean, there's obviously the health impact, there's the employee impact, or the fact that we're all dealing with different impacts to our employees, either their safety, remote workforces, et cetera. But we're also talking about the economy too. The economy is shifting and changing. And I don't know that any of us that on the conference today have ever been in a situation where the entire world ran into the exact same problem at the exact same time, and it affected people and health and the economy in the way that this has. So it's going to affect people differently, though. It's going to affect different organizations differently. It's going to affect individuals within the organizations differently. So we have to figure out, what does transformation mean to us? And the word digital can be a little misleading because it may or may not involve technology, by the way. There could be, as we'll talk about, ways that we can be moving forward without necessarily needing to take on a big, huge, massive, high risk type of project. So when we think of transformation, we think of looking at the more complete picture of what are the different technological options, what are the higher priorities, what are the ways that we can improve our business processes, not just to drive efficiency and lower IT costs, but maybe more strategic revenue enhancements and that sort of thing. All of us, every organization that I can think of is being forced into a transformation of some sort, whether they like it or not, whether they plan to or not. We're all being forced into it, third stage included. And I think all the speakers would agree too, that all of our organizations are being forced into a transformation, whether we like it or not. And so we have to be thinking about organizational change management, human capital management in a way that's completely different and that's especially focused and especially highly prioritized. There's also, the business value and transformation time and cost. We want to look at, how can we do this in a way that matches our respective risk profiles and is most appropriate for us. So that's, kind of a difference between the old way of thinking about ERP implementations and what we would consider a broader view of digital transformation. So I'd love to hear any thoughts you have, any questions you have too, as we're going here. So, if there's so far based on what I've said, I'd love to hear any thoughts around, what's resonating with you. Is there anything that, is there anything that resonates or doesn't resonate? Something that we're saying so far that's like, hey, this doesn't apply to me because we're in a totally different situation and here's how we're being impacted, whatever the case may be. I'd love to hear any comments you have. Just use the chat function here, and we'll. I'm actually watching it right now as you guys are submitting questions here. So one of the big things that we find with organizations that are going through transformations of any sort, it's one of the biggest problems is this whole concept of misalignment. And I have a whole session focused on misalignment later this week. And how to get alignment in your organization. And in fact, that was one of the highest rated sessions at our last in-person Stratosphere. So I encourage you to join that one. And so this whole concept of misalignment, we have a strategy as a company up here. We have the world that's affecting us with COVID and the economy and everything else in the world affecting us. We've got the strategy, and then our transformation that's down below needs to support that and be aligned with that. And what we found even before this whole situation we're in now, before 2020, is that companies were already having trouble staying aligned with their strategy, with their digital transformation. Now you throw in this big curveball that comes at you, and now a lot of organizations are probably questioning their strategies. In addition to that, they need to be questioning, does our digital transformation align with that new strategy that we're probably moving towards? And that may be why you see some of these responses around, the 14% that are scaling back their projects, or 20% that are pausing. Is a lot of those organizations, I suspect, roughly 1 in 3 of you are trying to figure out, how do we realign? How do we hit the reset button or pivot based on where the world is today? So if you don't mind, I'm getting a lot of responses right now, and this is awesome. So thank you. I'm just going to read a few of these, even though they're not scripted. That's not part of the presentation, just because I feel like this is kind of you talking about where you are. And I'm going to learn just as much from reading this as you all will. So one of the first comments here is impact for us is a major shift for all project staff and consultants working from home. So there's no face-to-face, but it's surprisingly working well, better than expected. And that's a great point, great question, or just a great comment, because that's something that we're finding too, is that the clients we're working with are surprisingly adaptive to this, and the workshops are going a lot better. In fact, it makes me wonder, after this is all over, things settle down and travel restrictions are banned, and non-essential travel is banned and all that stuff, how much of this is going to stick? Because I feel like there is a certain amount of this type of work that could stick and continue to be remote. I don't think anything fully substitutes face-to-face meetings, at least building those initial relationships, but I think you're right. There is a lot we could be doing now that we're learning as a human race on how to work remotely more often. Another comment is all other transformations depend on having good data, which comes from properly implemented ERP. Funny you should say that, because we're going to talk a lot about data. I believe it's either tomorrow or Wednesday. There's a session on cybersecurity and data. So we're going to completely unpack that comment. Another comment here that's really good that we'll get to in a later session too is there's too little emphasis on business case at the front end, which should define intended outcomes. Too little efforts at the front end results in unintended, maybe undesired outcomes at the tail end. So that's a great point. A business case more than ever is important now. As we'll talk about later, I think we're finding already, and I think we're going to see that risk mitigation, project governance, business case, accountability, those sorts of things, I think are going to be really common in the next couple of years as people navigate this new reality and the economy and just the different world we're in. I think that it's been kind of enough of a black swan event that organizations are looking at how can we mitigate, maybe not against that risk of the world changing in that way, but certainly preparing ourselves as an organization to be more prepared to handle risk. Another comment is COVID has really improved our organization's digital appetite and competence. Very interesting point. I'd love to hear more about that. Because I think you're kind of seeing this two extremes. You see these two extremes of how companies are responding. Some are in total retrenchment mode, as we saw from the survey results. Some are saying, nope, we're getting more aggressive and more strategic. And then there's a lot of companies that are somewhere in the middle. Here's a really interesting one that we're seeing a lot of with our clients too. And this is a great point. This one is our ERP project is slated to go live in July. Our current concern is with developing upcoming change management training and go live support activities in a COVID-19 world with folks working from home, unsure when we'll return to the office, et cetera. It's a great point. In fact, we have a call later today. Third Stage has a call with a client about that exact topic, as far as how can we manage some of those things. And we're going to talk about, there's a session later that Mike Graham from a company called Epilogue Systems is going to be hosting on workforce management. And he has a tool actually that his company offers. It's a remote, online subscription-based tool that allows for some of those change management types of training activities. But as far as organizational assessments and how to handle some of this stuff, I'm going to talk about that piece of it too in a session that I believe is tomorrow, I believe. And I apologize, I don't have the agenda in front of me, but there's a change management session. I encourage you to join on that one because we will talk about how to handle change management. So I'm going to come back to some of these questions, but keep them rolling because I love these questions here, or these comments. So as far as digital strategy, this is kind of your typical roadmap of what we would have said a company should be thinking about before the world knew what COVID-19 was. This is a high-level framework that focuses on 6 technology agnostic and objective work streams that we would typically walk our clients through. So it was interesting preparing for this session and just thinking about how do we pivot as consultants to help clients adapt to a changing reality. How does this need to change? Because we're kind of looking at everything we do and saying, does that make sense? What still makes sense? What's obsolete? What do we need to change in terms of how we operate as a business and how we help our clients? So this is the initial pass at it, or what we would normally recommend. And you can see there's different work streams here as you're defining your strategy and roadmap. They would focus on business process management, for example, organizational change management. Those are obviously the operational and people sides of things. So how can we ensure that our future state processes are aligned with our post-COVID-19 reality? We're going to have a session later in the week on supply chain management, supply chain transformation. A lot of company supply chains, especially ones that are in manufacturing and distribution types of industries, are being highly impacted by COVID-19 and the world around us. So how do we make sure that our future state business processes, using that as an example, how do we make sure that that future state matches what we need to have in the future? We also have some clients that are really focused on and doubling down on the whole human capital management side of things, the HR departments. How do we restructure HR and provide them the tools and the processes and the technologies to be able to handle just the mass amount of, sick time and, managing remote workforces. And some companies are seeing attrition. I mean, you're seeing at least in the United States, and I think a couple other countries are starting to see it too. You're seeing a lot of layoffs, a lot of companies going through attrition and furloughing people. So how do you manage that? How do you, that's going to put more pressure on HCM and HR. So we have to make sure that our roadmap for our business processes matches what that future is going to look like. Same with organizational change management. How do we help people through this? And we have to remember that, as we'll talk about in our change management session, we're kind of at the base. We're moving back toward the base level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs in some ways, where we're focusing on how do we take care of our health and take care of our families, and try to keep our spirits up when we're not able to leave the house. And so a lot of us are at that base level now. So how do we work? How do we manage change differently, knowing that in some ways we've reverted back to a lower level on Maslow's hierarchy? At the same time, we're trying to say, hey, at the same time, we're going to change your job, we're going to change your processes, all that stuff. Change management's really important. I've always said that, but even more so now. Enterprise applications, what technology makes sense to us? For a lot of companies we're working with are going through these big, massive, SAP or Oracle, Microsoft D365 types of projects. And some of them are finding that, hey, we don't need all this technology. We can't consume all this technology, and it's too much risk. So let's rethink how we're approaching technology. And maybe best of breed, or maybe just certain functions or modules makes more sense. It could be a way to risk mitigate, it could be a way to prioritize your needs and focus your transformation efforts. Solution architecture, how do we tie together all this stuff, all the data, the systems, all that good stuff? Business intelligence and analytics, still important. And then quality assurance, how do we manage the quality assurance throughout a transformation? So like I said, this is kind of I'll call it the old pre-2020 view of how we viewed transformation and strategy, and how do we help clients through their roadmaps. And we've got a lot of detail behind each of these work streams that we won't get into here in the interest of time, but I'm happy to share with you offline if you'd like to arrange a one-on-one session to cover any of this. But the whole idea here is then, well, what part of this is still relevant today and what isn't? And so what I did here is we took a pass at looking at, what could still apply today and what are the priorities today. So I highlighted in red the things that, in my opinion, are either still relevant today, or in some cases even more relevant today. And the ones that are not highlighted in red may be areas that for some of you are going to be lower priorities. But as we heard, 30% of you are continuing as planned, 10% of you are thinking about moving forward. So a third to half of you might still find that enterprise apps piece of it is still relevant to you in terms of looking at different technologies. And by the way, that enterprise apps middle work stream there that is not highlighted, it's also not a either or all or nothing type proposition, which of course in the downside of PowerPoint is a visual like this suggests that it's either or. But the reality is you may find that, well, it's not that we're not going to pursue enterprise technology, but we're going to do it a little more selectively, or we're going to change the focus or the priority. We might accelerate an HCM component. As a side note, I'll be curious to hear how many organizations move the HCM module of their big ERP implementation. Usually that tends to be an afterthought. That's kind of like phase 3 or 4, we'll get to HCM. I'll be curious to see how many of them moved that forward to phase 1 or phase 2, just because of the world we're in now, and the fact that talent and attrition and health and benefits and that sort of thing is going to be extremely important going forward, even more so than it already was. But when you look at these other work streams, then business process management, that's still very relevant. In fact, you could argue that's more relevant now, because a lot of us are being forced to re-engineer our processes, or certain parts of our businesses now need to change. So business process management can be a great way to take that first step, or if we're not sure if we're going to move forward with anything, or if we're on pause right now, that can be a great low cost, low risk way to figure out what do we do next. Let's start off by looking at our processes and figure out what's still relevant, what we need to change and modify to fit this new future. And then organizational change, something still very important. Solution architecture, very important, especially if we're looking at more of a best of breed scenario, or if we do decide that we're going to selectively deploy technologies but not bite off the entire enterprise-wide digital transformation right away. That solution architecture piece becomes even more important. Business intelligence and analytics, I think companies, again, in that spirit of being risk adverse, or more risk adverse than they may have been in the past, that's something that's going to be continuously important too. And then quality assurance will even more important in some ways because, again, we're focused on risk mitigation and project governance controls. And a lot of organizations right now don't have the margin of error to slip up or to spend too much or to let their timeline slip or to expose the company to too much risk. A lot of companies with where the economy is right now just don't have that luxury or that margin of error. So Brian, I don't know, any thoughts you have on these comments or these slides here?
No, I would definitely, I mean, you hit that focuses are changing. They're kind of staying the same, but changing to a degree. I would put extra focus also on business intelligence analytics for the main reason that a lot of people are changing their approach to business, disrupted supply chains. They're finding new ways to do things, modifications that have not been measured in the past. So the importance of immediate ability to look at the data, analyze it, sort it, could be increasing here in the very near future.
Yeah, I agree with that. Here's I'll just, as you were talking there, Brian, I was pulling up some of these other comments that have come in, but one here is our ERP project was slated to go live in July in alignment with the beginning of our financial year. Most of the vendors we are working with are from geographical region, UAE and India, and we are based in East Africa. The limitation to travel and lockdown has meant that we have to slow down the change and delaying go live. So that's a great point. And even if you weren't in Africa, relying on a company based out of UAE and India, a lot of companies have that same problem, even if they were in your same town or your same country. I think companies are struggling with that, is how do we manage change in a way that makes sense? And a lot of this is dependent on the company too. It's different. I think it's a little bit different when you've got mostly a white collar type of workforce, professional services, a law firm, or whatever the case may be, financial services. Those types of organizations, I think, are having an easier time adjusting to the change management and the remote workforce and that sort of thing. But if you're a manufacturing company, you've got people on the shop floor that are used to being shown how to do things, and they're not going to be sitting at home pulling up a Zoom like we're doing right now, all of us. That's going to be harder, and that's a bigger question: is how do we manage those people through the change, knowing that we would have to completely re-engineer how they learn and how they function as a business. So it's a really good point, and I think that it's important more than ever to recognize that there is no one size fits all solution or approach to how to manage this. Partly because it's so new, but partly because organizations are different. They all have their different needs, as you pointed out. Question here is what tools one has to use to bring effective change management. It should save costs too. Answer that, I'll tell you to come back to our change management session because we cover a lot of that in that change management, human capital management session. The comment here about best of breed equals worst of interfaces. That can very much be true, and that is a downside risk of best of breed. Is now you've got a ton of interfaces and a lot of stuff to manage, but you have to look at that risk versus the risk of one big ERP system that theoretically should take away a lot of those interfaces, but it's bigger risk and it could take longer to get to value and whatnot. So very broad generalization, but that's what we've seen oftentimes. Here's a really good question. What will the post-COVID world impact cloud and on-premise applications differently? I'd love to hear your guys' points, other speakers here, Brian. And I apologize if the other speakers here are not unmuted. I may have to go unmute you while Brian's talking here if you're not, but just chat me if the other speakers on the panel, if you're not able to unmute yourself, and I'll make you a co-host. But Brian, what are your thoughts here? I've kind of mixed thoughts on cloud here. Part of me thinks that there's risk and cost that people are going to be more sensitive to, but part of me thinks, if anything, it's proven that we need cloud because now people are more dispersed and remote. But what are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's a very broad question, because when you talk on premise, you're talking the concept of perpetual license. You can host on premise elsewhere. It doesn't necessarily have to be on site server based, but even if it is, we're very quickly coming to, just heard that several states are opening parks. They just opened the beaches in Florida. So things are turning. This is a short-lived thing. I don't think it's going to have that much of an impact. I mean, you need one person to go into a room and make an adjustment on a rack. That's not going to change. So I don't think this in particular, the whole COVID situation is going to influence that. However, we have seen a general trend to cloud for a number of other reasons. So I think in the broader scheme of things, it's staying about the same, but we are seeing a move to cloud.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. And I think that the thing that, I'd be curious to hear, Marcus, I think I just gave you control to where you should be able to unmute now. But I know you're going to talk about this in your session later today about negotiations. But I suspect you're seeing some cases where there's a need. There's the escalators and the cost increases and things that a lot of companies may have locked themselves into in some of these expensive cloud subscription-based solutions, but now maybe finding themselves backed into a corner. What are your thoughts on that, Marcus?
Well, I mean, I think the fundamental impact from a cloud perspective, at least from my view, from the contractual view, is, and you talked about this a little bit earlier, Eric, is to the extent that you've got a robust employee base, and all of a sudden a very significant amount of those employees are now furloughed, they're no longer accessing the software that you've paid a lot of money for. And I think it really is going to be critical, just from a cost-saving perspective, to go back into those contracts, reevaluate your relationship with these strategic vendors, and utilize whatever leverage you've got to be able to renegotiate or negotiate some sort of exchange, perhaps, or parking users, or what you want to do is reduce the fees associated with unused modules and unused users for things that you might actually need. So I think this is an opportunity to some extent to take a step back and really put together a strategy for where you're going next. Reevaluate those contracts that are critical, and use this as an opportunity to go back in and try to renegotiate or modify provisions that are incredibly onerous to you now, or that you can't possibly fulfill. So I think it's a good moment of reflection.
Yeah. Yep. And for others, for companies that are, if you're one of the 10% that are about to move forward with a project, this is a great time to negotiate. I mean, I know you're going to talk about this, Marcus. I don't want to steal your thunder, but there's a lot of leverage that these companies have, and it's a good opportunity to, in a number of ways, to look at reducing costs.
Right. And I think to the extent you've got leverage, you probably haven't had this much leverage in a very long time with these vendors. They're hurting as much as anybody else is. This is not, a robust time for people to be engaging with them and spending money on significant IT projects. If you don't have the ability or leverage now, it's going to be incumbent upon you to try to create some leverage. And the way that I would recommend doing that is possibly, if you're especially in a cloud scenario, is to make a request to renew early. And if you can renew early, now you've got the ability to renegotiate some of those onerous provisions that may be blocking you from reducing revenue. So I think with some creative approaches to this, you may be coming out better off than you might think you could.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. And at the same time, not make sure we don't overcommit or get too lured in by big discounts or the negotiation leverage, but there's definitely a lot of opportunity there.
Yeah, no, agreed. I mean, I think you've got to keep a level head with this, and if they're selling you, the Earth, the Sun, the Star, and the Moons, you've got to take a step back and things have fundamentally changed, but still things are the same as they were before. I mean, you've got to look at these things with a jaundiced eye and be critical of what they're offering to you, and look at the whole picture, because I think it's very easy, to be a penny wise and a pound foolish in this type of environment. They get you because you're in kind of an emergency scenario, and all of a sudden, you've agreed to, a maintenance agreement for the next 10 years that you wouldn't have otherwise agreed to, solely because that reduces your maintenance spend today by 30%. I mean, you've got to do what you've got to do, but you've also got to be careful about what you're getting yourself into.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if I might, on that same topic, knowing what your needs are today and how those have changed based on the current situation is just as important. You know, for those of you who are in the middle of a transformation that might have multiple phases, we often see a lot of transformations take the form of phase one is replacing what exists today, and then phase two and beyond becomes more of an expansion of functionality. You know, if you have contingencies on whether or not to proceed into phase two, you may be able to prolong that a little bit more, focus on what your real needs are today, get a good look at how they may have changed with the COVID-19 scenario, and reevaluate what your overall project looks like.
Yeah. And for what it's worth, there's a few comments that kind of fit in with what you guys were just saying, Marcus and Adam and Brian, around, one comment is we're going towards hybrid infrastructure with on-premise ERP, which is Infor M3, and native cloud finance solution, which is Workday, and plenty other peripheral apps, but also planning to move to cloud with ERP, Infor Cloud Suite. So at least one person in the audience is kind of agreeing that, going toward the cloud is still that long-term vision. Another comment is this event is forcing companies to embrace technology and push through the security testing roadblocks. So this could accelerate any shift to the cloud. Another comment is that, in my opinion, I think cloud will accelerate as a result. It is more elastic, the contract as well as growth, has more and more features and functions, access to data more readily, more securely, et cetera. So, and then also no requirement for IT staff to manage the infrastructure with long-term contract. So I think, it sounds like we're all kind of saying the same thing. Things will probably continue to go that way, but I think the key is to watch out for some of the downside risks and costs and things that you don't oftentimes think about. I know that's what Marcus and Daniel from Taft will discuss later today.
Yeah, and Eric, just one more point to throw in there. It is a long-term versus short-term decision, because there's a question earlier on best of breed, which inherently there's nothing wrong with it. That's where most application structures are going. However, if you're taking this from the approach of let's not do ERP, but let's build our own monster in completion now, there is some risk in doing that rather than looking at the ERP route. So do look at the long-term Band-Aids, quick fixes versus where you're heading long-term as you go through this.
Yeah, that's a good point. And that's one of the takeaways here that we'll cover, and I'm cover a couple slides here real quickly. I'm going to come back to this slide when we get into the what to do when your transformation is slowing down session, which I believe is tomorrow. We're going to cover this slide in more detail, but there's a lot of times where companies have moved ahead too quickly without a clear strategy and plan, and there's a lot of foundational stuff that they didn't do, and that can oftentimes lead to failure. And that was always the case. But what we're finding now in a post-COVID-19 world is that there are those foundational things that we either never did and should have done, or we have to redo it now because our strategy needs to shift. So I think it's a good opportunity to kind of revisit, what are those things and lessons that we had so far in the project, things we could do differently now, revisit. What are some of the foundational things we can get in place to help ensure that we are moving forward in the right direction, and that when we go to execute, we start doing so in a way that's very deliberate and gives us a solid blueprint for how that transformation is going to be deployed. And like I said, we'll talk about this here later, but you'll see that there's a lot to it that's outside the realm of technology. I mean, there's alignment, there's operational readiness, the people change management side of things, certainly the technology side, but also the project governance and planning side as well. And one of the big takeaways that we're finding now, that I mentioned before, companies are becoming more risk adverse. So they inherently are going to be less tolerant, either because they have no choice or because their mindsets are shifting as a result of COVID-19 in the economy, is that they're going to focus more on risk mitigation. And Stuart, Rob, and myself and others will have a presentation on Friday that's focused on risk mitigation and quality assurance, and we'll unpack this concept in a little bit more detail. But just to summarize or set a preview, in the meantime, this is a framework that we use to assess projects and make sure they stay on track, make sure that we identify risks and mitigate the risks along the way and remediate those risks. And we actually use the same framework for our expert witness practice. So one of the things I didn't mention in the introduction is that a big part of what third stage does. And what I personally do as well is, I'm an expert witness, and we're expert witnesses in lawsuits involving ERP failure. We use the same framework when analyzing a lawsuit. So it's one of those battle tested frameworks that's been battle tested for extreme scenarios like a failure or a lawsuit. And what we do is we use that for our other clients to help them make sure they don't end up in that same boat. So risk mitigation is a critical priority for sure. So what I'm going to do, love to hear any questions you have. We're going to finish up here in the next 3 or 4 minutes. I'm going to go through some of the questions I didn't get to yet, some additional comments here. Love to hear any other thoughts or questions you guys have, either on the panel, the speaking panel, or the attendees here. But another comment here, while we're waiting for other questions or comments, is there's a comment here that we agreed that there would be acceleration in cloud adoption. I've noticed multiple lift and shift happening and not adopting the transformational approach. And that's a good point too, that, moving to the cloud isn't quite as simple as lift and shift. A lot of vendors like to sell it that way because it sounds good. It sounds like we're just kind of moving everything over to the cloud, and how hard can it be? But the reality is there's a lot of new processes, new capabilities and functions and impacts to people that are inevitably going to happen. And like I said before, we can't overlook change management as a lot of organizations have in the past. Even more so now, we have to be real sensitive to how we do that. And I think, probably the most interesting comment that supports that point around the importance of change management was the comment I just read off a few minutes ago around the go live being delayed in Eastern Africa. That, because of the consultants being in a different part of the world and having to do this remotely. And I actually know who this person is that made the comment, and I know enough about their business to know that that's probably because, the type of workforce they have and where they're based and the industry they're in, that change management becomes even more important, more difficult. So that's something I highly encourage you to think about as you think about your transformation strategies. How can we better leverage change management and process improvements to help? But what about the rest of the speakers on the panel? What other thoughts would you close with? What are some of the kind of the key takeaways you'd leave us with here?
I would jump in on the change management side again. As your transformation looks on paper from a perspective of your project plan, your budget, your costs, those are things that are easy to see whether or not they have changed. In a lot of cases, the only change is the timeline from what you're going to see from your consultants on the other side. But every employee who works for you, their life has changed dramatically. And that means that their need for this transformation may have changed, whether it's emphasize greater need for this transformation or a bit more of a fear of it. And those are going to be things that are really difficult to identify until it's too late. I'd encourage a bit of a cautious approach to understanding how this impacts your people and how it impacts their value statement to your company. Everybody comes to work for a reason, and their reasons may have changed rather dramatically, and the way that they think about this is sure to have changed rather dramatically, and that's not going to show on paper. So you'll want to make sure that you're looking at how you approach your people, and when you get back into this and you flip the switch back on, how do you do that in a way that they're ready for it and accepting of it? You could have the most bulletproof change management program before COVID-19, and all of a sudden it could very well be in shambles now because nobody knows what's going on. All of a sudden we're right back to normal. Is that true? What is normal now? And how have those things changed definitionally? So take a real close look at those types of tactics so that you know whether or not you are where you think you are with regard to things that aren't just easy to show black and white on paper.
Yep. For me, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Eric.
No, go ahead. I was just agreeing with him, actually.
Yeah, here's what my takeaway is really. It's, take a practical approach to this. Oftentimes vendors, when they're trying to get you to sign a contract, they come out of the gate and they say, look, we're a partner with you. We want to be a strategic asset to you. And as you grow, we grow. And, certainly there's a level of sales puffery associated with that. But this is the time to take that out and dust it off and come back to them and say, look, you know what? when I signed this agreement with you 6 months ago, you said that you were our strategic partner. And here's what I need from you now. And I think, it's really easy, to look at these things from an adversarial perspective and to try to enforce contractual terms. But I think what you want to do is take a step back and really analyze this, like I said, from a practical perspective. What can they do for you? Go to the decision makers, and that's probably not the sales rep that you initially dealt with, and come up with some strategic and creative resolutions to whatever problems that you're experiencing now. And then document those either in a change order, an amendment, or a new SOW, or whatever contractual framework you're in. Come up with some kind of an amendment that's going to serve you, for the life of how long this pandemic lasts. Make it limited in nature, so that you've got flexibility for when this thing is over. But I think look at this practically, come up with some creative solutions, and hold that vendor's feet to the fire.
Yeah.
So
Great
something
feedback.
sorry, Eric, something that I've observed too, right? As far as making lemons out of lemonade right now, this situation is not good, let's say. However, it is showing you most companies are working or effectively performing outside the bands of their normal operating envelope. So you get to see things expose pain points, cost issues, or performance problems a lot more visibly right now because they're just so apparent. So it can be an opportunity to take that step back and reprioritize some of your objectives, the business drivers and business case of that, and try to make sure that your plan is effectively organized now that you see what your business looks like in a condition that you weren't expecting, but might, happen again in the future. So take advantage of it, try to capture some of those impacts and be prepared to address them as you get back into the process.
If I could add to that, maybe, I think one of the effects too, the long-term effects that this is going to have is kind of the elevation of business continuity in digital transformation strategies. I think business continuity up to this point has been kind of bare bones, like how do you keep IT running? How does payroll continue? If there was a major business continuity, effect. But I think what is going to happen moving forward is just like every digital strategy has a risk section and major project has a risk section. I think we're going to start to see business continuity sections, because I think what we're finding is that it doesn't have to stop business. A major event like this, we can continue these digital transformation projects remotely. So as long as we have that plan in place and as long as we've kind of addressed it up front.
Yeah, it's very true. Well, I want to thank you guys, the panel, for the discussion here today. We're going to take a quick 5-minute break, move into the next session, which, just to go back to the agenda, will be it's a panel discussion around how organizations are adjusting their transformation in today's realities. So we're going to build on that poll that we released at the beginning of the session. We're going to jump back into this here in about 5 minutes. You're welcome to stay on the same link. This room will remain open, and hope to see you all here in a few minutes. We'll get the next session started here in about 5 minutes. I just keyed out.